I rise to speak on Bill C-24, and I have to say it's rather surreal that we are here debating this bill, a bill that is essentially about increasing the salaries of a few Liberal cabinet ministers. It really speaks to the priorities of this government or the lack of priorities. You know, during the 2015 election, the Prime Minister criss-crossed the country, and he made a big deal about the fact that if he was elected, he would appoint the first gender-balanced cabinet in Canadian history. And, of course, we know the Prime Minister was elected, and on November 4th, 2015, he had an opportunity to fulfill his election promise. And he appointed his cabinet on that date, and on its face, it appeared that the cabinet was gender equal. The only problem, Madam Speaker, is that not all ministers are equal. There are full ministers, and then there are ministers of state. What is the difference between a full minister and a minister of state? Well, to begin with, Madam Speaker, a minister of state does not have a full department. They don't manage a full department budget. A minister of state doesn't have a deputy minister that reports to them. A minister of state doesn't have the same power and the same authority as a full minister. And so the only way the Prime Minister was able to fulfill on its face a gender-equal cabinet was by filling the 5 junior portfolios, the 5 ministers of state, with female MPs, and then he could say he had a gender-equal cabinet. Well, it didn't take long for a number of people to point out that the Prime Minister's gender-equal cabinet wasn't as equal as he made it out to be. And so, what did the Prime Minister do about it? Well, he played essentially a game of pretend. He began by changing the titles of the ministers to remove Minister of State and call them a minister, to create the illusion, to create the facade that those 5 junior ministers without full departments are in fact the same as ministers with full departments. And then the Prime Minister increased the salaries of those 5 ministers, again, junior ministers without full departments, to put their salaries on par with ministers of full departments. And now, to complete the facade, the Prime Minister has introduced Bill C-24, in which the government is asking Parliament to rubber stamp what the Prime Minister did. Now, I guess, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader, other members of the government, the Prime Minister have talked a lot about the problem that they have with 2 tiers of ministers. But the irony, in fact, Madam Speaker, is that Bill C-24 doesn't eliminate 2 tiers of ministers. In fact, what Bill C-24 does with respect to those 5 junior ministries is migrate them over to a new category called ministers for whom a department is designated. Now, in the case of those ministers, they would have their resources from the department of another minister. It sounds, Madam Speaker, an awful lot like a minister of state. So, in substance, what is the government doing? The government isn't doing anything to solve the problem that they purport exists, which is the problem of 2 tiers of ministers, Madam Speaker. But, for the Prime Minister, it doesn't really matter, because for the Prime Minister, it's all about optics. It's all about looking good. It's all about pretending that he is a champion for women. Of course, when one looks at the record of this Prime Minister when it comes to supporting women, it really is a wanting record. We have a Prime Minister who has done virtually nothing to assist Yazidi women and girls who are suffering torture, who are suffering among the most egregious human rights violations imaginable, to help them come to Canada. The Prime Minister has done absolutely nothing, next to nothing. We have a Prime Minister, or feminist Prime Minister, who's going to remove genital mutilation from the Citizenship Guide, Madam Speaker. So the Prime Minister talks a good game. He creates a nice facade. He uses women to make himself look good. But when it comes to substance, when it comes to doing something meaningful, the Prime Minister, time and time and time and time again, is AWOL, Madam Speaker. You know, but I guess what else to expect from this Prime Minister? We, after all, have a Prime Minister who is a failed Prime Minister. A Prime Minister who, in the last 2 years, has blown the budget. A Prime Minister who has returned Canada to long-term structural deficits. A Prime Minister who can't get anything done. He can't get TPP done. He can't get softwood done. He can't get NAFTA done. He can't get pipelines built. He presides over a government plagued by scandal and corruption. And he is a Prime Minister who is under investigation as we speak. So, with a record like that, I guess what else is there to do beyond taking selfies, appearing on American television to talk about his socks, and introduce hollow, meaningless bills like Bill C-24 to waste Parliament's time. You know, I have to say, it is a little bit ironic that the government is introducing this bill, and it speaks to their priorities because, of course, this is a government that is making life more difficult for everyday Canadians. They're taking more out of the wallets of middle-class Canadians. They're going after and shaking down vulnerable Canadians like diabetics to raise revenue for this cash-strapped, spendthrift government. They're declaring war on small businesses. And so while they make Canadians pay, when it comes to helping themselves, when it comes to giving themselves salary increases, they're all in. They're all in, Madam Speaker, because what Bill C-24 is really about, it isn't about gender equality, it's about liberals helping liberals. Hear, hear. And, you know, to talk about the arrogance, the entitlement, the condescension of this government, it was remarkable that the Prime Minister and members of this government tried to insult the intelligence of Canadians by proclaiming that this bill was about gender equity. On February 2nd, 2016, none other than the President of the Treasury Board said, quote, "We are committed to pay equity in our cabinet, and the government will soon be bringing forward legislation to ensure that all cabinet ministers receive equal pay." That was the President of the Treasury Board. Of course, Madam Speaker, Bill C-24 has nothing to do with pay equity because the principle of pay equity is equal pay for equal value. Bill C-24 does nothing of the sort, which is why it was laughed out of committee by expert witnesses on the question of pay equity. Madam Speaker, Bill C-24 is a joke of a bill. It is one more reason why 2019 can't come soon enough.
Hear, hear.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Humber River Black Creek.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I just have to say, sometimes listening to some of the comments from the other side of the House just make you have to stand up and make a comment in one form or another. The whole issue of equity is an important thing for all of us, and certainly the status of women, the Minister of the Status of Women, is equal to every other minister we have in the House. And what we're trying to do with C-24 is to promote more gender equity all the way through the service. I'd like to hear some comments from my honourable colleague on the issue to do with the gender balance. He was talking about the fact that our Prime Minister hasn't accomplished anything. Well, I think when you look at trying to look through our budget through a gender lens as to the impact on women. And then as a side note, what about the 600,000 jobs that has been created? Our economy is doing better than any other country in the G7. Somehow I think my honourable colleague forgot to read that press release.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Well, Madam Speaker, in reference to Bill C-24 and this falsehood being put forward by the government, but this is about gender equity, let me quote Professor Margot Young of the University of British Columbia, who specializes in gender equality, to quote what she said about Bill C-24. She said, quote, "To loosely categorize legislation that essentially isn't really about gender equity as responding to a gender equity concern is, as I said before, dangerous." And she went on, Madam Speaker, to say, quote, "Really, there's no gender substance, no equity on the basis of gender equality to this legislation." I think that pretty much sums up Bill C-24 when it comes to this false notion that it has anything to do with gender equity.
The
honourable member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte. Thank you, Madam Speaker. I absolutely agree with my colleague on the issue of equity. But here's another aspect of the bill that I'm concerned with, and that is that one minister is going to be responsible for the regional development agencies, the Minister for Mississauga. Here we have a government that appears to only be interested in big cities, and when it comes to a riding like Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte, it's even of greater concern because we're not going to have a minister responsible for economic development in that region of Quebec. We have very unique issues in our ridings, and we won't have a minister who is familiar with those issues, and I find that very worrisome. I'd like to know if my colleague thinks this is a good idea or not when it comes to the economic development of our regions.
Edmonton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I thank my colleague, the member for Saint-Hyacinthe-Bagotte, for that very important question, because she's quite right. On top of increasing the salaries of certain Liberal ministers, Bill C-24 does away with regional economic ministries. And it's not just Quebec, it's Atlantic Canada. As an Alberta MP, I similarly share the minister's concerns, the member's concerns, and I have to say it really is inconsistent, because this is a government that talks so much about working with the provinces, talking about working with municipalities, and here they are eliminating regional representation at the cabinet table to bring the unique perspectives of regions of Canada by doing away with these regional economic portfolios. Madam Speaker, I think it is a mistake on the part of this government.
Questions and comments? We have time for a brief question. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
In rebuttal to that last comment from my honourable colleague across the way, I want Canadians and Atlantic Canadians to be reassured that this government has a keen focus on the economic development of our regions. It couldn't be more apparent than through the Atlantic Growth Strategy that has the support from the highest reaches of this government, from the Prime Minister through the Immigration Minister, and the implementation of an Atlantic Immigration Pilot Initiative that will help the economic development of our region in Atlantic Canada, something that the previous government under Stephen Harper never had a view on towards. Atlantic Canadians remember the comments about the culture of defeat that Stephen Harper issued untowards people in our region of the country, and they're proud of the work of this Liberal government providing economic growth as a strategic initiative for the people of our region.
For an answer, the honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
I'll speak to what Bill C-24 is doing when it comes to Atlantic Canada in terms of eliminating regional economic ministries. As a result, there is now a delay in processing times at ACOA. Ministerial approval delays are occurring. A 30-day processing time has now turned into a 90-day processing time thanks to this government.
Debate.